I should say before I go much further, right, because I do feel, actually I've got quite used to this now, you know, I feel quite comfortable.
Oh, you look very well, do you know?
Well, it was made for a slimmer man, and you tell me the slimmer man was in fact John Malkovich.
Yes.
Mark, I can see your problem, because this is the granddaddy or grandmother of the sycamores, and it really is a beautiful tree at this stage, isn't it? But you don't like it. It's not that you don't like it, right? You don't like its offspring.
Yes.
So whilst he would have been regarded here as a war hero, surely in America he would be regarded, or maybe even still regarded, as a villain.
Yes, well, that's the story about Ross himself isn't widely known.
What's in a name? What indeed? Well, when Sir Edward Trevor married Rose Usher in the year 1612, she became, obviously, Rose Trevor, and perhaps he named the place in her honour, as some have suggested. Or perhaps it's the rose that could be derived from Rose Castle, an anglicised version of Castlin Rory, a stronghold of Rory McGuinness. Or perhaps it was never Rose at all, but an uncorrupted Ross, the Irish word meaning a wooded headland, for indeed this place abounds with such. In any case, as Shakespeare might have put it, faced with such a conundrum, a name by any other rose would smell as sweet. Welcome to one of the sweetest places in the entire country, to Rostrevor on the shores of Carlingford Lough in the south of County Down. Whether viewed from the shores of the Cooley Peninsula across the loch, or from the deck of a passing ship, or from the timbered slopes of Slieve Martin towering above it, Rostrevor, more than any other town or village in Ulster I can think of, is instantly recognisable, which means that it's easily brought to mind, easily fashioned in your memory, embellished in your imagination. It's the detail you remember, the turrets and towers, the spires and chimneys amid the trees and leafy glens. The way its streets and roadways have been shaped by mountain gradients and curtailed by loch shores and river banks. For all its power to imprint pictures and stir the imagination, it's impossible to imagine Rostrevor anywhere else. It all seems to fit beautifully together. The human imprint, anxious it seems not to break the spell, to maintain that picture book perfection bestowed by nature. It's the kind of land and sea and townscape, it is said, that inspired C.S. Lewis to create the imaginary world of Narnia. And Lewis did indeed spend many a day spellbound amid the hills and heathery paths that had spawned other, more ancient mythologies. And along the banks of the Kilbrony River, where doubtless he would have encountered a breed of fairies native to Rostrevor, the Brunies, who have a reputation for mischief tempered by benevolence. These days they seem content to yield right of way in the fairy glen to the local human population, in the daytime at least. The fairies are reputed to keep to the lower reaches of the Kilbrony River, wisely perhaps, for up here in the foothills of the Mournes, 900 feet above the village and Slieve Martin, well, here be giants. This is the Clockmore Stone, a famous landmark here in the slopes of Slieve Martin above the village of Rostrevor. Now, Clockmore, as I'm sure you know, simply means big stone, and indeed it is aptly named, for you're looking at about 30 tons of solid granite. Now, even though it's been here for thousands of years, it's still a blue one. It doesn't really come from here. Now, there are two theories as to how it actually ended up here. One rather fantastical notion is that it is an erratic. That is, a stone that was brought here from Scotland during the last ice age and left here when the glaciers retreated about 10,000 years ago. As I said, a bit far-fetched and hard to swallow. The other, much more likely explanation for me is that the legendary Irish giant Finn McCool was fighting an enemy here on the slopes of Slieve Martin, and he picked up the Clockmore Stone over in the Cooley Peninsula and threw it, and it landed here on the mountain, killing his enemy. Now, this theory has its sceptics as well, of course, the complete absence of any trace of an enemy being one of their main arguments. But Finn McCool was renowned for his aim as well as his strength. So to all sceptics, I simply say, has anybody looked under the Clockmore Stone? Heaven knows what you might find under the Clockmore Stone, so in the meantime you can believe whichever theory takes your fancy. Under this tonnage of granite you'll find John McCavitt and myself. John is an author, historian and teacher who has many publications to his name, and one of the subjects he has turned his attentions to is one of Rostrevor's most illustrious sons, Major General Robert Ross of Bladensburg, in whose honour this extraordinary monument was erected in 1826. He's relatively little known in this age, but at the time of his death his fame as a war hero would have rivalled that of Admiral Nelson. Among his exploits in the American War of 1812, having already distinguished himself throughout the Napoleonic Wars in Europe and North Africa, he won the Battle of Bladensburg before taking Washington and burning the White House. He himself was killed at the Battle of Baltimore in 1814.
So, whilst he would have been regarded here as a war hero, surely in America he would be regarded, or maybe even still regarded, as a villain. Did you come across any American historians or anybody else who's responsible for, or who does the same kind of thing you do over there? I mean, what would their attitude have been towards him when you encountered it?
Well, I can tell you this. I met an amateur historian, and I don't mean that disrespectfully. I mean as a local historian in the area where Ross was shot and killed. He served in the First Gulf War. He was wounded in the First Gulf War. And he told me that General Ross was my kind of officer.
Oh, really?
Correct.
Right, so he's forgiven for burning down the White House?
Well, absolutely. Well, it was his own people, forefathers, who killed him, but he liked Ross as a military leader and had that appreciation. But of course, you will get divided opinion. I mean, I met somebody in one of the libraries I went to, and I asked him about these papers about General Ross. Oh, he said, that ruffian that burnt my city. And of course, why wouldn't they feel like that? There's a sense of grievance and to some extent humiliation that the American people may still feel to this day that their capital was captured and the White House burned. At a later stage, the army that Ross had led after his death was almost annihilated at the Battle of New Orleans in 1815. The Americans were led by a man called Andrew Jackson, first Scots-Irish president of the United States of America. And the army he led was overwhelmingly made up of Scots-Irish.
Scots-Irish. There were Irish on both sides in these battles in those days, not the case?
Yes, well, I began this story, a number of years ago. I live locally and been doing a number of projects, but I always targeted the Ross story. And up until a couple of years ago, this whole site was completely overgrown. In other words, in 20 years in Rostrevor, I have never sat on these steps, couldn't see what was up there. But I decided that was my next project. So I was absolutely stunned by what I found out. The first thing, of course, we knew Robert Ross captured Washington. Then I discovered that the 4 regiments that he led were commanded by Irishmen. Now you say to yourself, maybe a coincidence. Further research in London, and I'm pretty sure at this moment, half the troops that General Ross led to America were Irishmen. And then, as you quite rightly point out, on the American side, so many who fought against the British Army were actually Irishmen, indeed United Irishmen.
I see.
The restoration of this site to its original glory coincided with John's researches into the Ross story. And I had the temerity to suggest that, as a local resident and a neighbour of Ross, separated by only 200 years, might he be in danger of losing a bit of his professional detachment in writing about a local hero. Nothing could be further from the truth, he assured me, and as evidence of this, he offered the following criticism.
My big criticism is that he allowed family matters to influence professional matters.
In what sense?
Well, in the sense that I'm trying to work out why he decided to accept the American command. Because, as I said earlier, his wife and him had planned to build a retirement home here. And I have evidence that his wife became depressed as a result of his American command. Local tradition says that she had a premonition of his death. And his letters throughout his time in America indicate that he was very worried about his wife's health. So I believe, and I'm still working towards this, that he forced the pace in America. That as the commander of the British Army, what is he going to do? Is he going to play for time? Or is he going to go for the great victory and hopefully get back home? So I actually think that in going for broke against Washington and later trying to capture Baltimore, that he was perhaps unduly influenced by the love of his wife, who he knew to be unwell.
A good historian, I'm learning, needs detachment certainly, but he also needs empathy and an ability to see the human being behind the image. The Ross Monument, as you can see, is a prominent feature of the coast road between Rostrevor and Warren Point, dwarfing all around it. Further inland and up the old pilgrim's route via the Fairy Glen and the Kilbrony River is a modest monument to a man who quite literally dwarfed all around him.
Finn McCool is easily the most famous giant in Irish mythology. Famous all over Ireland, famous all over the world in fact. But there is another Irish giant from these parts who for a time at least eclipsed even Finn. And he was a real giant. His name was Patrick Murphy, and he was born near here in 1834. He grew to the height of 8 feet and 1 inch, recorded at the time as the tallest man in the world, and he died in 1862 at the tragically young age of only 28.
Patrick Murphy's grave is to be found in the old graveyard at Kilbrony, alongside the ruined church which stands on the site of St. Brona's early Christian foundation. This really is the ancient heart of the parish, a parish we'll explore a little further when we return.